I couldn't believe it when I saw my wife kiss her boss at the company couples dinner, so I went over to them and told her, "I hope you know what you're choosing." At the time, she just smiled sideways, as if she were ignoring me, as if everything we'd built meant absolutely nothing compared to some ridiculous, pathetic, and mediocre fantasy. But when the divorce papers arrived at her house and her boss ended the affair, she understood that she traded something lasting and loving for something short-lived and loveless. And when she came to me, begging for a fresh start, I'd already decided I had to move on. And without her. They say the worst part of betrayal isn't the lie, but the contempt. And I felt it in her eyes. That night wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a slip-up. It was a conscious choice, in front of everyone. A public humiliation disguised as charm and restrained smiles. She knew exactly what she was doing. I saw her look at him. I saw the way she touched his arm. It wasn't the first time. It couldn't be. And even if it had been, the way she looked at me when I approached was enough. A look empty of remorse. Empty of any trace of guilt. As if everything we'd experienced was a cheap memory, replaceable by any kind of attention from someone with status and power. She smiled. Smiled. While I, standing there, torn between shame and fury, tried to remember the moment I became invisible within our marriage. I drove home that night in silence. My steps seemed to float in a void that swallowed my breath. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just existed. Existence was too heavy at that moment. As I drove back, I remembered the smallest details. The times I woke up in the middle of the night just to cover her with the blanket. The nights I arrived late and still brought her flowers. The dinners we had together in silence, but where the silence was comfortable. The trips. The cuddles on the couch on Sundays. I gave her my all and never asked for much in return. Just respect. Just love. Just that she not throw me away like something disposable. But she did. And worst of all, she didn't even hesitate. She didn't call. She didn't text. She spent the days as if nothing had happened. As if that kiss in front of everyone wasn't a knife in my chest. I, on the other hand, understood everything. In silence. I made my decisions. I handed in the divorce papers. If she wanted to live out the fantasy, so be it. But not with me anymore. She only came after me when she realized the spell had worn off. When she discovered that the other man, the one she'd sacrificed our story for, only saw her as a pastime. That what seemed like a forbidden tale was just a brief, dirty, and convenient fling. He ended it. He cut ties. And she came back to me. With red eyes. With a trembling voice. Talking about our love, as if she hadn't trampled on it. But I wasn't the same anymore. Something inside me died that night. Something essential, something that couldn't be rebuilt. And I told her I couldn't go back. She insisted. She cried. She begged for forgiveness. She said she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. And maybe she had. But when she tried to touch me, I backed away. And when she asked if we could start over, I simply said it was too late. She'd traded love for an illusion. And now, reality was suffocating her. What she didn't know, and what she would discover in devastating fashion, is that she would soon find in our old home a symbol of what she had destroyed. In a desperate attempt to win me back, she brought a box of memories. Photos of us. Old letters. A note I had written years ago that she never gave me. I opened it. I read it. And the contents shattered me. It was a letter written during a trip I had taken, in which she said she was afraid of losing me, that she loved me more than anything, that sometimes she felt she wasn't enough for me. It was a letter filled with insecurity, fragility, and genuine feelings. And at the same time, it was proof of how far she had lost herself. Because anyone who feels all that and still betrays is not well. They are broken inside. And maybe they really were. But that letter, which could have rescued me years ago, arrived too late. Now it was just a cruel reminder that while I fought for our love, she was already silently burying it. And by delivering that letter, she thought I would give in to nostalgia, that perhaps there was a bridge to return. But I looked at her steadily, took a deep breath, and said, "It all lost its value when you changed our story for a moment." She froze. It was as if each word had been a blade against her skin. And for the first time, I saw true despair. I saw the realization sink in. She fell to her knees. And I, motionless, just watched. Because forgiveness may exist, but there are pains that make return impossible. The ironic thing is that, after all this, I didn't feel hate. I felt pity. She had destroyed something rare. Something many spend their lives searching for and never find. True love. Simple. Imperfect, but loyal. And she traded it for an affair that even she couldn't sustain. Her boss discarded her. Loneliness swallowed her whole. And me? I finally understood that sometimes the greatest form of love is knowing when to let go. But the most curious thing was what happened next. Something no one could have predicted. Something that began innocently, almost imperceptibly. And that would change everything. Because even when we think all is lost, life holds surprising new beginnings in store for us. And sometimes, they come from where we least expect them. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but they reflect real pain, clearly showing how betrayal is capable of destroy lives, homes, and true loves. This channel exists to open eyes, not to justify mistakes. Get ready, because today's story is deeply shocking, intense, and unforgettable. Take a deep breath. And feel what it's like to be betrayed. Noah was always a man of simple habits but a complex heart. His days began early, with the gentle sound of the alarm clock and the faint morning light streaming through the windows of the house he helped build alongside Emma, his wife of 12 years. Breakfast was almost always the same: buttered toast, fresh orange juice, and 2 scrambled eggs, prepared with almost ritualistic precision by Emma, who prided herself on caring for the home with dedication. The couple's routine, at first glance, seemed tedious to those who didn't know what it meant to love consistently. But there was a kind of quiet beauty in that repetition, a comfort that only those who know the intimacy of a true relationship understand. The routine was like a choreography constructed by the two of them, and even on the silent days, there was understanding. Noah wasn't a man of big words, but his actions spoke volumes. The way he placed his hand on her back when crossing the street, the way he made her tea when she had insomnia, or the way he left the car warm on cold mornings, were small gestures, but they were imbued with love. Emma was a woman with a gentle presence but a strong gaze. As a young woman, she was known for her infectious joy and ability to light up any room with a laugh. She had studied art out of passion but ended up becoming an event coordinator at a company that handled marketing for major brands. Her organized and detail-oriented manner earned her praise wherever she went. But what truly defined her, besides her efficiency, was the way she looked at the world, with a mixture of hope and slight melancholy. When she met Noah, she was enchanted not by anything grand, but by the peace he exuded. Unlike the men she had dated before, he didn't seek to impress, he only wanted to build. And she, tired of shallow promises, decided to believe in the stability he offered. They married on a late autumn afternoon, with fallen leaves on the ground and an orange sky witnessing their vows. The ceremony was intimate, full of sincere glances and shy laughter. That day, they were both certain they had found something rare. Their marriage went through phases like any other. The early years were filled with discovery, adjustments, sleepless nights, and simple joys. Then came the challenges, the fatigue of work, the pressure of commitments, and, later, the failed attempt to have children, something that for a long time consumed them in silence. Despite their mutual desire, time passed, and the treatments were ineffective. Gradually, they stopped trying, not because they stopped dreaming, but because they learned to live with the idea that perhaps their destiny was to care for each other more directly. There was never any resentment between them because of this, just a kind of pain that settled among the other memories of the house. Still, the house remained full, with books, plants, paintings Emma painted on Sunday afternoons, and the constant presence of friends who saw in the couple a rare example of true companionship. Noah worked as a financial analyst at a mid-sized brokerage firm. It wasn't a dream job, but he did it responsibly. Their life was stable, without luxuries, but also without absences. On weekends, they enjoyed cooking together, going for walks on nearby trails, and sometimes traveling to small towns where they could get lost in cobblestone streets and hidden cafes. There was a quiet lightness between them, a kind of love that doesn't need daily declarations to be felt. Neighbors called them the quietest couple in the neighborhood. And indeed, there was a connection between them that was hard to find. Over time, Emma began to grow within the company. She was recognized for her talent, charismatic leadership, and the way she handled projects. She began to be invited to corporate events, gala dinners, workshops, and occasional trips. Noah, always understanding, encouraged her. He was never the controlling type. He trusted her and was proud to see her admired for her competence. Despite some changes in routine, he continued to keep the house organized, taking care of the little things, ensuring she returned to a welcoming home after long days. Emma noticed these gestures, but gradually began to disconnect emotionally. Not for lack of love, but because life began to demand a different presence from her. Her attention began to divide. Her gaze began to wander elsewhere. Still, she maintained the couple's rituals, breakfasts, hugs before bed, texts throughout the day. Emma's work environment was hectic, full of inflated egos, impossible goals, and competitive people. But she stood out for her empathy. She knew how to lead without raising her voice. She knew how to earn respect. It was in this context that she began working with the company's CEO, an experienced, charming man with a kind of magnetism that couldn't be explained but was noticeable from the very first moment. He treated her with attention, praised her decisions, and gave her space and prestige. At first, everything seemed strictly professional. But something began to change. Small comments, smiles that were too long, casual encounters outside the office. Emma, caught up in a stressful routine and lacking emotional stimulation, began to allow herself to feel something she couldn't name. And even though she hadn't crossed any line, she began coming home with distant eyes, responding to Noah's caresses with distraction, and smiling less on Friday nights. Meanwhile, Noah didn't fail to notice. He was observant. He knew how to read her silences. But he chose not to press. He believed everyone went through phases. That patience was all it took. That maybe everything would even out. Instead of complaining, he began to lavish more attention on small displays of affection. He bought flowers on an ordinary day. He had breakfast in bed on a winter Sunday. He suggested a trip for the two of them, just to escape the routine. Emma thanked him, smiled, but her eyes always elsewhere. At night, when he lay beside her, she noticed his body was present, but his soul always seemed a few feet away. And that began to hurt. But he remained silent. He believed that love was also about resisting the winds. As the months passed, corporate events became more frequent. The invitations became more personal. Emma began to be absent for longer periods, citing commitments that required her presence. Noah never suspected. He'd never been that kind of man. He trusted. And that trust, until then, was the foundation of what they'd built. But even the strongest foundations begin to crack when they're not supported by reciprocity. Still, he said nothing. He kept everything in notebooks where he wrote down what he wanted to say but didn't. He kept it all in long glances at the window, in glasses of wine drunk alone, in songs that reminded him of the beginning of it all. Emma, for her part, felt a growing confusion. She was torn between the life she'd built and the desires that were emerging with force. She began to feel alive in contexts that had nothing to do with her story. And at the same time, she felt guilt. A subtle but constant guilt that hid behind makeup, formal smiles, and well-articulated speeches. Inside her, a silent battle raged every day. Sometimes she looked at Noah sleeping and wondered how she'd gotten here. How a love so certain could seem so distant. But before she could delve into these questions, her phone vibrated. The world called her back. And she went. While the house remained the same, they both changed without realizing it. Emma, increasingly immersed in a world that distanced her from the essence of what she had once been. And Noah, trying to keep the flame of something that no longer held the same warmth alive. The days continued to pass. The seasons followed. The garden bloomed, the windows opened, the furniture was cleaned. From the outside, nothing seemed out of place. But inside, something essential was slowly being lost. And then a dinner, one of those organized by the company to recognize the year's highlights, was scheduled. A formal event, with elegant attire and long speeches. Noah was invited as Emma's date. It was a way to show employees that the company valued their families. She hesitated, but eventually invited him. He accepted immediately, happy to be by her side in such an important setting. He dressed in his best suit and prepared himself meticulously. He wanted her to be proud to have him there. He wanted to feel like he was still part of her world. What Noah didn't yet know was that that dinner wouldn't mark just another night of corporate celebrations. It would be, unforeseeably, the breaking point of everything he believed to be solid. A night when his eyes would see what his heart wasn't ready to accept. A night that would leave deep scars, the kind that forever changed the way he loves, trusts, and exists. But what exactly happened that night? What made everything fall apart before their eyes? And most of all, what could happen after love was tested in the most brutal way possible? The hotel's main ballroom was lit with golden hues and an elegant glow that reflected off the glasses carefully lined up on the tables. The company's annual dinner brought together all the important figures, from top executives to team leaders, always accompanied by formal smiles, forced toasts, and carefully rehearsed speeches. Emma moved among the guests naturally, as if the room were an extension of herself. The black dress with a subtle neckline accentuated her figure, and the pearl earrings Noah had given her years ago dangled softly from her ears. When he saw her crossing the room, for a moment, he forgot all the doubts that had consumed him for the past few months. She was beautiful. And she was still the woman he loved. He'd arrived early to accompany her from the beginning of the event, but she had already gone ahead and seemed immersed in conversation before he could even ask her to take a photo with him. It was as if she'd already become too integrated into this world, while he still felt like a temporary guest. For the first hour, Noah tried to fit in. He sat at his assigned table, chatted with a few couples, complimented the dishes, and listened to compliments about Emma's performance from colleagues who spoke of her with almost exaggerated admiration. He smiled and nodded, but inside, something nagged at him, not her success, but the way everyone seemed to know a side of Emma he didn't. Between conversations, he noticed glances passing between her and one man in particular, a tall man with neatly trimmed gray hair, a confident expression, and a commanding posture. He hadn't introduced himself to Noah, despite having seen him alongside Emma several times in photos from previous events. At one point, when the speeches began, Emma sat next to Noah, but she didn't hold his hand, rest her head on his shoulder, or even look him directly in the eye during the applause. It was as if there were an invisible barrier there, one that only he felt, or preferred to believe he felt. After dinner, everyone went to the terrace where a relaxed cocktail reception would take place. The ambient noise was subtle, side conversations formed, and gradually, the couples dispersed. Noah went to the bathroom and, upon returning, found Emma nowhere to be found. He walked along the terrace, looking around, until he decided to re-enter the main hall. It was then, as he was passing through one of the corridors connecting the hotel's private areas, that he saw a partially ajar glass door, through which muffled voices could be heard. His intention had never been to listen, much less eavesdrop, but something in his intuition made him pause for a second. And in that second, everything changed. Through the crack, he saw Emma standing, too close to the same man who had been watching her all night. He had one hand on her waist and the other resting against the wall, in an insinuating posture, and although Emma's arms were lowered, her expression wasn't one of rejection. It was a restrained, knowing smile. A smile Noah hadn't seen in a long time. And then, in a few seconds, before she could even process what she saw, the man gently pulled her and their lips met. Noah froze. Time seemed to slow down. Each heartbeat reverberated in his ears like a drum. He couldn't breathe. His body trembled uncontrollably. That image, however brief, would be enough to erase years of memories. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the context. It was the indifference. It was the fact that she knew he was there, that night, in that space. And yet, she chose to ignore it all. Without thinking, she pushed open the door and entered. They both stepped away suddenly, as if his presence were an inconvenient surprise. Emma looked at him with eyes that tried to hide her panic, but the truth was already there for all to see. He didn't scream. He didn't make a fuss. He simply approached with firm steps, his eyes fixed on her, and said in a firm but pained voice, "I hope you know what you're choosing." And at that moment, she smiled. A brief, nervous, disconcerting smile. A smile that carried pride, confusion, and contempt all at once. As if she hadn't expected to be confronted. As if she were certain he wouldn't be able to do anything. Without waiting for an answer, Noah turned and left. He walked down the hallway as if fleeing an explosion. His chest burned. The ground felt unstable. And inside him, something was crumbling beyond repair. Outside, the cool night air barely managed to penetrate his lungs. He sat on the stone bench beside the hotel's outdoor garden and remained there for minutes that felt like hours. His trembling hand held his cell phone, but he couldn't type, call, or write. The silence around him contrasted with the internal chaos that consumed him. For the first time, he felt small. As if he'd been ripped from his own story. As if he were a disposable character in the plot he thought he'd built together. The image of the kiss, the touch, Emma's gaze, replayed like a waking nightmare. And even there, in that raw pain, there was still love. And that love hurt more than any betrayal. Because, deep down, I still wanted to believe there was an explanation, that maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. But there wasn't. That night, Noah didn't come home with Emma. He texted her that he needed space. She responded with a simple, "Okay." No excuses. No apologies. No attempt to explain. Her silence hurt more than the kiss. At home, he spent the night awake. He paced the dark living room. He looked at the paintings on the walls, the travel photographs, the books they'd shared, the memories that once comforted him and now hurt. He lay down on the bed, but the pillow smelled of her, and that made him get up again. He sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey in his hands, watching the cloudy sky, feeling like a stranger in his own home. In the following days, Emma tried to contact him. Brief messages. As if nothing had been so serious. As if the betrayal wasn't a definitive breakup, but just a common mistake. Noah didn't respond. He occupied himself with work, with long walks, with silent visits to places they used to frequent together. In every corner of the city there was a memory. And in each memory, an open wound. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know when he began to be forgotten. When he stopped being enough. And as much as anger wanted to take over, what he felt was a profound sadness. The feeling that he had been loyal to someone who, at some point, decided to go it alone. Emma showed up at the house on Thursday. She didn't announce herself. She just knocked on the door, her eyes puffy and her hair disheveled. She carried an envelope. She said she needed to talk. That she was confused. That this wasn't what it seemed. Noah let her in. They sat on the living room sofa where they'd often cuddled together and watched movies. She started to talk, but he barely listened. He was numb. Her words came with shallow, fragmented justifications, as if trying to mend something irreparably broken. When she finally stopped talking, he got up, walked to the bedroom, grabbed an envelope similar to the one she'd carried, and came back. He handed it to her. She opened it. It was the divorce petition. Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to argue, saying she still loved him, that it didn't have to end like this. But Noah, for the first time in a long time, felt firm. He looked at her calmly and simply said that it was necessary. That it wasn't about hate, but about dignity. And that perhaps, in the future, she would understand. Emma left without another word. Her car disappeared around the corner as quickly as his heart sank. But that night, he slept. For the first time in days, he slept. Noah began to reorganize his life. His routine. His thoughts. He took pictures off the shelf. He rearranged the furniture. He bought new paintings. He began to allow himself to think about himself. But he didn't imagine that what was yet to come would be more painful than the kiss he'd witnessed. There was something more. Something hidden, veiled, that explained more than he knew. And that something, when it came to light, would change everything forever. The morning silence in that house felt different. Thicker, more present. Noah woke to the light filtering through the curtains, walked to the kitchen, and made his coffee as he did every day, but this time his movements seemed automated, soulless. Her absence no longer hurt with the same intensity, but there was something strange in the air, as if a cycle hadn't yet completely closed. The divorce had been filed. She hadn't contested it. But that Friday, an unexpected message arrived on his cell phone. A short, direct message, signed only with his name, "I need to see you. There's something you don't know. Something I should have told you much earlier." He hesitated. He didn't want to relive pain that had barely healed. But his curiosity was uncontrollable. And, deep down, there was a morbid desire to fully understand the depths of the abyss into which he had been thrown. They met at a discreet café, far from the places they usually went together. Emma arrived first, sitting at a corner table, her eyes fixed on the cup in front of her, untouched. When Noah entered, she looked up and, for the first time since the breakup, didn't try to smile. She was thinner, paler, but what was most striking was the emptiness in her eyes. He sat without saying anything, just waiting. The sounds around him seemed distant. People laughed at other tables, glasses clinked, but all that mattered was that space between them. She took a deep breath before beginning, as if she needed to find the courage to shed a mask she could no longer maintain. She began by saying she wasn't there to ask for forgiveness, that she didn't expect a fresh start, nor did she want pity. She said something had been stuck in her throat all those months, and she couldn't go on without letting it out. Noah remained silent, his eyes fixed on hers, allowing her to continue. She said that during their marriage, there had indeed been moments of doubt, moments when she felt disconnected, moments when she searched for meaning in everything, even without knowing exactly what was missing. And it was during this search, according to her, that she made the mistake of getting close to someone who represented the exact opposite of the life she led. The kiss he witnessed, she said, was only the visible part of something that had been building for months, but what he didn't know, and what she never had the courage to reveal, was that that betrayal hadn't been the first. Not with that man, but with herself. Noah clasped his hands together under the table. This wasn't what he expected to hear. But she continued. She said that after the divorce was finalized, she went to their house. She needed to experience the place one last time. And upon entering, she found a forgotten box inside the guest room closet. An old box, where they kept mementos from the past. Inside were letters, exchanged notes, photographs of trips. But among all those items, there was a small letter she had never read. It was a letter written by Noah 2 years ago, which she had forgotten there out of distraction, or perhaps carelessness. Emma took it from her bag and handed it to him. Noah read, with a heavy heart, each line written simply but honestly. The letter spoke of his fear of losing her, of his desire to start over, of his desire to have children, or at least to build new memories together. It spoke of plans he had never had the courage to say out loud, but which, on paper, revealed themselves with an almost childlike delicacy. She was crying now, the words coming out in sobs. He said that letter was like a blow. Because, at the very moment he was writing about loving more, she was already looking at someone else. And what hurt most wasn't betraying her marriage, but betraying the love he offered, silently, every day. He said he'd read that letter dozens of times since then, trying to understand how he could ignore so much. Noah, still in shock, just listened. But there was more. She said that in the days following the separation, she tried to reconnect with herself. She started writing in a journal, went to therapy, sought to understand the origins of her choices. And it was in that dive that he came face to face with the harshest truth. It all didn't start with a lack or an oversight. It began with an internal flaw, with an inability to recognize stable love as enough. She said that for years, she believed she needed intensity, passion, something to make her feel alive. And only after losing everything did he understand that what he missed most was precisely the peace he had despised. But the final blow was yet to come. She said that, right after the end of her affair with her boss, she tried to get back together with him. She called, texted, and went to his house. And that day, she wasn't just rejected, she also witnessed something that destroyed her. She saw Noah accompanied by another woman, a familiar figure, a discreet presence from her past, Sophia. A friend from her old college group, someone she'd always considered too nice, too simple, someone she'd never imagined could be seen as interesting. She said that, seeing them together, laughing, exchanging sincere glances, she felt for the first time the true weight of the choice she'd made. And that she wasn't there to try to separate them, but to deliver the letter, as a last attempt to give him back a part of herself that she'd stolen. Noah placed the letter on the table carefully. His breathing was slow, but his mind seemed to race in every direction. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and firm. He said that for a long time he had wondered where he had gone wrong. That he had tried, in vain, to understand how someone who shared his days, his bed, his dreams, could simply discard him. And that now, hearing all of this, he understood that the problem had never been him. That it wasn't about being more or less passionate, more or less daring. It was about her. About a relentless search for something that even she knew nothing about. And that, although he appreciated her sincerity, there was no longer room for regrets. She tried to smile, as if accepting the sentence. But before leaving, she handed him another envelope. She said there were photos inside, not to hurt him, but to show him that, despite the betrayal, not everything was a lie. That the moments they shared were real, even if she was lost later. Noah took the envelope without looking. He didn't need proof. The past, for him, no longer required justification. What mattered now was what would come next. Emma stood slowly, adjusted her bag on her shoulders, and before leaving, she simply said, "I lost you the moment I thought you'd always be there. And now, I see that your silence hurt more than any scream you could have let out." And then, she was gone. Leaving behind an empty chair, a letter read too late, and a man who, for the first time in a long time, knew exactly who he was. And knew he would never be the same again. The envelope, left on the table, remained untouched. But inside it was something that had not yet been revealed. Something Noah would discover in the coming hours. Something that would complete the puzzle in an unexpected way. And, more than that, it would completely change the way he viewed everything he had experienced. Because some truths only hurt when they become undeniable. Noah sat at that table for several minutes after Emma left. The envelope in front of him felt like a forbidden object, a final piece of a puzzle he wasn't even sure he wanted to finish. The coffee was cooling in his cup, the movement in the room was beginning to intensify, but he didn't move. His eyes fixed on the envelope like someone staring into a mirror that revealed not only their face, but the scars of their soul. When he finally stood up, he tucked the envelope into his inside coat pocket and left without saying a word. He walked aimlessly through busy streets, trying to escape himself, until, on impulse, he entered a small bookstore he used to frequent before everything fell apart. The smell of old paper enveloped him like an ancient memory, and for a few minutes, he allowed himself to forget. Back at the apartment, after a long, silent shower, he sat in the living room armchair with the envelope in his hands. The world outside followed its usual rhythm, but inside, everything still pulsed in ruins. When he opened them, he found some old photos, Polaroids he didn't remember taking. In them, simple moments, real smiles, ordinary afternoons, details that already seemed forgotten. But among the photos, there was a letter. Unlike the other, this one was recent. Emma's handwriting trembled on some words. She said she couldn't move on while there was a part of her still buried in the past, and that there was one last truth he needed to know, something that could clarify not only the reason for the betrayal, but the void she had been trying to fill for years. The revelation wasn't in the exact words, but in the emotional content they carried. Emma said that, months before everything happened, one random afternoon, she accidentally found an old notebook of Noah's, tucked away in her office drawer. In it, among bills, ideas, and reminders, was a short paragraph, like a confession. Sometimes I wonder what my life would be like if I'd stayed with Sophia. She's always been a light in a dark time, but I didn't have the courage to choose the most uncertain path. I hope Emma never sees this. Not because it's wrong, but because she'd never understand that loving someone doesn't mean never having doubts. Emma said that the text, read out of context, was like a bombshell. She never said anything, never asked. But something inside her broke that day. He began to see signs where there were none. He began to feel replaceable. She began to want to be desired the way she thought Sophia had been. That silent insecurity gnawed at her. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't a rational decision. But it was the spark that lit the flame of dissatisfaction. And instead of facing it, she ran away. She sought outside for the validation she felt she'd lost at home. She said she knew it was an immature reaction, but that at that moment it seemed like the only way to feel alive, important, seen. And the cruelest thing is that, by seeking outside, she ended up exactly where she feared, being replaced. When she saw Noah and Sophia together weeks later, she understood that she had destroyed herself not out of revenge, but out of insecurity. And that, in the end, she became exactly what she promised never to be. Noah finished reading with trembling hands. There was no anger, no revolt, but a different kind of mourning, as if he were burying an old version of the life he'd lived. What impacted him most was not the betrayal itself, but its origins. Knowing that a single sentence, never spoken aloud, had planted the seed of an irreversible abyss. And for a moment, he wondered if it could have all been avoided. If only he'd been clearer, more present, if only he'd destroyed that notebook. But he quickly dismissed the thought. He knew her mistakes were her own choices, not the consequences of her vulnerabilities. Still, understanding her motivation made it all the more painful. At the end of that letter, Emma asked to see him one last time. Not to try to get back together, but to personally return a book he had lent her early in their relationship. A book of poetry she said she hated at the time but now read with a lump in her throat. He said the return would be symbolic, a worthy closure to a story that, despite its tragic ending, was real. Noah hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted this reunion. But something in his words sounded like genuine regret, not manipulation. He accepted. They arranged to meet in a quiet park late in the afternoon. The sky was a soft amber, and the wind blew lightly. Emma arrived first, sitting on a bench under a tree, book in hand. When she saw him, she stood up. She looked different. There was something genuine in her simplicity. Neutral clothes, loose hair, no makeup. Just her. She handed him the book gently, unhurriedly. She said that rereading those poems had been like revisiting a place where she had been happy but could no longer inhabit. Noah listened to her, and for a moment, he saw in her the woman he had once fallen in love with. They talked for a few minutes. About the past, about what could have been. Emma said she was leaving town, that she needed to start over somewhere she wouldn't be remembered for her mistakes. She said she didn't carry any expectations, but that she needed to say goodbye with dignity. Noah, in a calm voice, thanked her. He said that, despite everything, he was rooting for her. He hoped one day she would forgive herself. And that, although there was no longer room for them, there was enough respect not to let resentment fill what was left. The final embrace was long. Not a reunion embrace, but a goodbye embrace. An acknowledgement of what had been and acceptance of what would never be again. When she pulled away, her eyes were teary, but there was peace. For the first time, Emma seemed to understand that certain choices have consequences that cannot be undone, and that maturity often comes too late. That same day, when Noah returned home, he found Sophia waiting for him. Sitting on the couch with a slight smile, holding 2 glasses of wine. She stood up, walked over to him, and hugged him tightly. They didn't ask anything, they didn't need to. She knew he had said goodbye to a ghost, and he knew that, with that, something real was beginning. Not the same as what he had with Emma, but something new, with different colors, different possibilities. Noah didn't forget. He didn't erase the past. But he learned to move on from it. And when he looked at Sophia that night, he understood that love isn't about how long it lasts, but about what it transforms. And that sometimes, to find the truth, you first have to face the pain head-on. Because only after devastation can you build something that truly makes sense. The end of that encounter in the park left something suspended in the air, a kind of silence no longer filled with sorrow, but with conclusions. Emma followed the path she had chosen, moving away from the city, the familiar faces, the home that now lived only in her memories, and the person she had believed for so long would be there unconditionally. Noah, on the other hand, no longer saw himself as a victim. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because it had transformed. He had gone from wound to scar. And scars, even if they don't hurt, tell stories. He no longer needed answers. Everything had been said, exposed, understood. And in that painful but necessary understanding, he found the key to completely freeing himself from a narrative that no longer belonged to him. The following days were strangely tranquil. There was a calm in everyday gestures, as if the body, after so many months in a state of emotional alert, could finally rest. Sophia became part of the scene naturally. She didn't invade spaces, didn't demand promises, didn't press for definitions. She simply was. And this presence, simple and constant, was exactly what Noah needed at that moment. Together, they shared silent coffees and spontaneous laughter. They didn't talk much about the past. There was an implicit, almost sacred, respect for each other's time. But they also didn't hide from it. When something hurt, they spoke. When something bothered, they clarified. It was a relationship built on what had been learned the hard way: truth is always better than doubt. Emma, for her part, wrote. In a black-covered notebook, she recorded stray thoughts, fragments of memories, pain, and small discoveries about herself. There were days when she wrote compulsively, trying to understand every twist of her choices, every omission, every gesture that had hurt. Other times, the notebook would remain closed for days. In those moments, she simply observed the people around her, trying to relearn how to live without masks. She discovered that solitude, though cruel in the beginning, could also be a form of rediscovery. She changed her haircut, changed her way of dressing, abandoned social media and old contacts. It was a slow, sometimes confusing, but necessary process. For the first time in a long time, she was being honest with herself. There were no more excuses, no distractions, no momentary relief. There was only her, facing the truth she had always avoided. Meanwhile, Noah resumed his old habits. He went back to running in the mornings, visited friends he'd drifted away from, rearranged the books on the bookshelf, and hung new paintings on the living room wall. Some objects were removed, others repositioned. It was more than just decoration, it was a way of declaring to his own home that a new chapter had begun. With Sophia, things flowed unexpectedly. She had a subtle way of fitting into spaces without dominating them. He knew how to listen, but he also knew when silence spoke volumes. She was different from Emma in almost every way, but not in the most important. She had the courage to feel, to be vulnerable, to build slowly. And that was enough. Despite the lightness that was beginning to inhabit his days, Noah didn't forget. The memory of the betrayal wasn't a ghost haunting his every step, but rather a scar that throbbed from time to time. Especially when a situation arose that made him question his own intuition, his trust in others. He was more cautious, more attentive to the signs. Not out of distrust, but because he now knew how deep a lack of communication could reach. On one of those nights when his memory insisted on returning, he decided to reread some of the letters he'd written to Emma and never delivered. They were letters written with pain, but also with hope. Words that never reached their destination, but now, upon reading them, seemed to no longer belong to him. He closed the last one and put it back in the box. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about him, and how much he had grown. The dilemma began to emerge when Sophia, on a quiet afternoon, suggested a trip together. A weekend in a small town, surrounded by nature, where they could get away from it all for a few days. Noah hesitated. Not because of the invitation itself, but because of the symbolism. Accepting meant more than simply traveling. It was making official that something new was being built. It was allowing a new bond to emerge without the shadow of the old. He looked at Sophia, who awaited his answer calmly, without pressure. And he said yes. It was a yes that didn't scream, but carried weight in meaning. A yes that said, "I'm ready." The trip was more than a break from routine. It was a kind of baptism. They walked cobblestone streets, slept with the windows open, cooked together in a rented house in the woods. They laughed at simple things, shared long, unashamed silences. One day, as they walked along a trail and a light rain began to fall, Sophia stopped, looked at him, and told him she wasn't afraid of being the next in an unresolved story. She said she knew where he was coming from, but that she was there for who he was now. And that if, at any point, he still had doubts, she would rather he be honest than pretend he was ready. Noah held her hand and, in a firm voice, told her that perhaps there were still doubts, but none of them concerned her. He said he didn't know how long it took for a heart to fully heal, but that he knew for sure that he wanted to stay by her side while she figured it out. Sophia smiled. And in that smile there was welcome, not pressure. There was love. Back in town, the days resumed their course, but something had changed. Noah now felt whole. For the first time, he carried no guilt or resentment. He had overcome something he thought was impossible to overcome. And the most surprising thing is that by forgiving Emma, by accepting his failure without justifying it, he had freed himself from a part of himself that always sought validation in others. He no longer needed to prove himself worthy of love. He no longer needed to rebuild what had been destroyed. He was building something new, with a solid foundation. Emma, on the other hand, found a way to transform her pain into movement. She began volunteering at an organization that helped women in emotional crisis. She discovered that her story, however painful, could be useful. At one of the meetings, she heard from a woman that her greatest fear was being forgotten. Emma smiled bitterly and said that sometimes the greatest punishment is not being forgotten, but being remembered for who you no longer are. That touched something in her. She understood that she might never completely forgive herself. But that she could keep trying. And that, for now, was enough. They both followed different paths. One rebuilding love, the other rebuilding themselves. But there was something between them that would never be erased, the awareness that certain choices have permanent consequences. And that forgiveness, even silent, is the only possible bridge between the past and freedom. As they walked apart, they left behind more than one marriage. They left behind old versions of themselves. And even if memories crossed their minds or in unexpected places, they knew nothing would ever be the same again. It didn't have to be. Peace isn't found in remaking stories, but in accepting that they accomplished what they needed to accomplish. And yet, something inside Noah told him that the true closure of this story was yet to come. Not in the form of a reunion, but in the form of truth. Because, no matter how much he had heard everything, felt everything, and forgiven everything, there was one final page that had yet to be turned. And that page would be revealed when he least expected it, in a simple, unassuming moment, but with the power to transform not only his perspective on the past, but also on the future. Because life, even when it seems to have stabilized, always holds one final truth. It was an ordinary morning, one of those unannounced mornings, when Noah received an unexpected call. The number on the screen wasn't saved, but something about the sequence struck him as familiar. He answered in a neutral voice, without expectations. On the other end, the female voice hesitated for a second before introducing herself. It was Lara, a former co-worker of Emma's, someone Noah had exchanged few words with over the years. She apologized for the intrusion, said she didn't know if she should be doing this, but that there was something that needed to be said, something she had kept bottled up for too long, and now, seeing everything that had happened, she felt she could no longer remain silent. At first, Noah didn't understand the reason for the call, nor was he prepared for what was to come. But when Lara mentioned a certain day, a company trip that had taken place months before their separation, something sparked in his memory. Sitting at the porch table with his cell phone pressed to his ear, he heard Lara say, in a trembling voice, that she had been present at many moments by Emma's side, not as a close friend, but as someone who, upon closer observation, saw cracks no one else could see. He recounted a specific incident during that trip, a casual dinner after the last meeting, where Emma had drunk too much and, amid laughter and innuendo, made a comment about having a plan B ready in case her marriage failed. He said that, at the time, the comment was interpreted as a joke, an impulsive outburst. But days later, Emma was seen leaving her boss's room in the middle of the night. This sparked speculation, which was never confirmed. But now, knowing the outcome of the story, Lara said she felt unwittingly complicit in a pain that could have been avoided. She said she expected neither forgiveness nor gratitude. She simply wanted to ease her own conscience. Noah listened silently, without interrupting. When the call ended, he held his phone in his hands for several long minutes. That information didn't change the facts, but it added a new layer to the story. A plan B. A sentence that kept hammering in his mind like a reopened wound. Everything he had built to overcome the past seemed, for a moment, threatened by that sentence. Not by the betrayal itself, but by the coldness implicit in it. Emma hadn't simply slipped in a moment of weakness. She had devised possibilities, considered escape routes even before the end. And that hurt differently. More sharply. More definitively. Sophia sensed something was wrong the moment Noah arrived home. He wasn't a man of outbursts, but his silence spoke volumes. She asked what had happened, and he reluctantly told her. Not because he wanted to share his pain, but because there was no more room for hiding between them. Sophia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she simply held his hand and said she understood. She said that, even though they'd moved on, certain blows came late, but they still hurt. She told him he didn't need to be strong all the time, nor pretend everything was okay. That she would be there, even in the moments when the past insisted on bleeding. And it was in that embrace that Noah cried. Not with anger, but with relief. Because for the first time, he no longer needed to keep anything to himself. In the days that followed, Noah plunged into a kind of internal reorganization. He wasn't in crisis, he wasn't in a meltdown. But he needed to realign his pieces. He began to write. Not letters, not messages. Just loose thoughts, unfiltered outbursts. One morning, he wrote about feeling loved only to the extent that was convenient. Another night, he wrote about the fear of always being someone's second best. Deep down, he knew this wasn't Emma's fault. It was simply the mark of a relationship that ended the way it shouldn't have. And acknowledging this was part of the healing process. Sophia, through it all, remained present with an almost silent generosity. She didn't try to fix things, didn't offer solutions. She simply looked at him with that calm look of someone who understands that loving someone also means accompanying their shadows. There were times when Noah considered walking away. He thought she deserved someone whole, not a man still mending broken parts. But she firmly rejected that idea. She said that no one is whole all the time. That love is precisely choosing to stay while the other person rebuilds themselves. And that constancy was all he needed. Meanwhile, life was returning to its routine. The appointments, the walks, the late afternoon coffees. But there was a subtle difference. Noah now allowed himself to dream again. He began making plans. He talked to Sophia about traveling more, about perhaps moving house, seeking a new space, free from old memories. Sophia smiled with her eyes, as she always did when something truly touched her. And in that conversation, which began unpretentiously, came the first time they spoke about a future without fear. About real possibilities, not as an escape, but as a choice. Meanwhile, Emma continued her silent journey. She had moved to a smaller town, starting over with limited resources and much more conscious choices. Volunteering had become an essential part of her daily life. Helping other women rebuild their stories was a way to cope with her own guilt. And although she still felt Noah's absence like an unfillable hole, she didn't seek him out. She knew there was no more space there. But, from time to time, she still wrote him letters she never sent. They remained hidden in a box under her bed, like testaments to a love she herself had destroyed. It was during a photography exhibition, where Noah had been invited by a friend, that something unexpected happened. Among the paintings hanging on exposed brick walls was a section on absences. In it, portraits of objects forgotten by people who had passed. And among them, there was a photograph of a letter, on folded paper, with a small, framed excerpt: "Perhaps, if I had listened better, if I had felt more and planned less, we would still be there, sitting on the same couch, sharing the silence that only two who know each other deeply can endure." Noah paused before the image for long minutes. He recognized that handwriting. He felt that phrase. It was Emma's. It was hers, and he knew it. He didn't try to find out how the letter got there, nor did he want to find out if she had authorized it. He simply left the gallery, his heart full of memories. Sophia walked beside him, and without him needing to explain, she simply held his hand tighter. Not as if demanding explanations, but as if offering support even without understanding. And it was then that Noah knew for sure, his story with Emma had ended in pain, but his love with Sophia was blossoming into maturity. And that perhaps this was the right love. Not the most intense, nor the most impulsive, but the truest. When they returned home that night, they sat on the couch and talked about everything. About losses, new beginnings, fears, and discoveries. Noah spoke of how painful it was to recognize he'd been replaced before he'd even left. And Sophia shared her own fears, of not being enough, of being just a patch. But by the end of the conversation, they were closer than ever. Because there, between two imperfect people, was a simple truth: they were choosing each other. Every day. And that choice was greater than any past. The story that began with a devastating betrayal now took a completely different turn. There was no happy ending in the traditional sense. There was realism. There were consequences. But there was also redemption. And this redemption didn't come from asking for forgiveness, but from rebuilding in silence, with respect, with patience, and, above all, with truth. What Emma did marked lives. But what Noah chose to do with that mark was what changed everything. There was still one last thing missing. One gesture. A symbolic closure. And he knew exactly what he would do. Not for her. But for himself. And that gesture would change everything. The final page of that story began to be written on a silent Sunday, when Noah, without saying a word, got up early, calmly dressed, unpacked the box containing old letters, memories that had withstood time and even abandonment, and headed alone to an open field on the outskirts of town. It was a place he discovered with Sophia on one of their walks, where the sky seemed clearer and the silence seemed to embrace everything. There, standing before a patch of still virgin earth, he dug a small hole with his own hands and, without ceremony, buried the box. Not as someone erasing a history, but as someone who finally understands that certain things belong to the past, and that letting them go is the only possible way to move forward without carrying the debris of what no longer exists. When he got up, he carefully covered the soil, dusted off his hands, and simply gazed at the horizon. A light wind passed over him, and in that moment, he understood the meaning of true closure, not oblivion, but liberation. On the way back, she stopped at a florist and bought a small bouquet of sunflowers, Sophia's favorite flowers. When he entered the house, she was waiting for him, sitting on the sofa with a book on her lap and a serene look that, even without words, always knew how to welcome him. He gave her the flowers without saying much, just with a lingering kiss on the forehead and a hug that said more than any speech. In that embrace was promise, truth, and above all, choice. They were there, aware of everything they had experienced before meeting, and yet, determined to stay. The past was no longer a threat, it was just a closed book. Days later, Noah received an unexpected letter, this time from Emma. It wasn't dramatic, nor was it filled with emotional appeals. It was simple, direct, and mature. She said she was leaving the country for a year-long volunteer project. She had made the decision to start her life over from scratch, far from the places that constantly reminded her of her mistakes. She said she was well, at peace, and that although the longing still lingered, it was no longer a longing filled with desire, but with acceptance. The last line simply said, "Thank you for being the kind of love that showed me what I didn't know how to appreciate. Today I understand. And, even too late, I hope you know, it wasn't all a lie." Noah read the letter once, folded it carefully, and put it in a new envelope. Not to keep it out of attachment, but out of respect. He knew that this was, indeed, his final goodbye. And by keeping it, he finally closed the most painful chapter of his life. Emma left without fanfare. She boarded the flight with a small suitcase and a heart already hardened, but beating for a new chance. On another continent, among strangers, she began to rebuild herself. Working with at-risk children brought a kind of meaning to her life she had never found before. She gradually discovered that true love begins when you can forgive yourself. And although she knew she would never get Noah back, there was a new purpose in her journey, to find peace, even without redemption. The night still brought memories, but now she knew how to live with them without drowning. Because regret, when it doesn't paralyze, teaches. Sophia, in turn, became more than just a new love in Noah's life. Over time, she solidified herself as his life partner. Someone with whom he built not only new stories, but also new versions of himself. She didn't shape him, didn't fulfill him, she simply walked alongside. Their relationship was serene, yet full of life. They traveled together, cooked together, cried laughing over silly things, and argued when necessary. But above all, they lived truthfully. One day, sitting at the breakfast table, Sophia took Noah's hand and said, "I don't need to be the woman in your life. I just want to be the woman in your new life." He responded with a look that said it all. Because there, amidst so many ruins and reconstructions, there was a love that needed nothing to prove, just to exist. Time passed, as it always does. And with it came new cycles, new losses, new achievements. But that story, with all its twists and turns, forever shaped the way each of them viewed love. Emma learned that love isn't what fills voids, but what's built when you're already whole. Noah understood that love isn't a promise of eternity, but a daily choice to stay, even when everything seems to suggest otherwise. And Sophia showed that loving someone isn't about competing with their past, but helping them understand that the present can also be home. This story ends where all great stories should, at the point where pain becomes learning, regret becomes transformation, and love, finally, becomes peace. There are no absolute villains or heroes, just human beings, flawed, complex, but capable of starting over. If you've made it this far, please comment on what you thought of this story. What would you have done in Noah's place? Or in Emma's place? Your opinion is very important to us. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel now for more stories like this, full of twists, turns, and profound reflections. Remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship, it erodes trust, breaks family bonds, destroys memories, and often closes doors that never open again. Love is a choice, but so is betrayal. Every action has consequences. And forgiveness isn't always enough to rebuild what was broken. This channel does not support, encourage, or romanticize any type of betrayal. Here, we tell stories that expose, truthfully and unfiltered, the devastating effects it causes. Because only by showing the real pain betrayal leaves can we understand the value of what truly matters: loyalty, respect, and true love.